going to come into our next part. We're going to be looking more at the early Christian acceptance of war. We are going to look first at the wars of the Old Testament, their Hebrew history. So, in the Christian mindset, in those early Christian writings, and you can see that the way they talk about it, there's a distinction between the way that they live and the way that they act, and what they see in the Old Testament, right? And the wars and the punishments of the law and all these things. And it seems that those early Christians, they just kind of accepted that. They didn't really think about it very much, maybe. That, how is it so different, our life from the Old Testament? It was kind of strange. Now, they believed that the scriptures were divinely inspired, right? So they just kind of took it for granted. Well, that's God's word. We can't challenge it. And they said this is a recorded history, right? That's there, and these things are all divinely controlled. God wanted this to happen and that to happen, and he did all these things. And whatever happened in those books, right? Whatever it was that they saw written down, those were sacred things. Right? Those weren't open to debate, they weren't open to criticism. Right? You can't say, well, Abraham, he didn't really do this, he wasn't really a good guy because of this. They held Abraham as a good man of faith. But the thing is, there's no Christian writers that assume that everything that is in the Old Testament is okay for us. There's lots of things that happen in there that we're not supposed to do. Right? Some good examples are concubinage, right? The idea that you can have many wives, slave wives, and have all these children. Christians did not do that, right? It was the accepted Christian practice to have only one wife. And really, I think that kind of came part out of the Jewish practice of the time. They had gotten away from all that. Prostitution also. Paul never criticizes Abraham or Rahab, right? Rahab, the prostitute from Jericho, is considered a person of faith, right? Praise her faith. How does that match up? Well, that seems to be a little inconsistent, maybe, but they didn't think about it that way. Now, they treated the wars of the Old Testament in basically the same way. You see these great men of old doing all these things. The writer of Hebrews has a chapter on faith, right? And he talks about great men like Gideon and Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, the prophets. What did they do? By means of faith, they subdued kingdoms, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, and routed armies of foreigners. Right?
Good evening.
Well, these guys did all this. If they were warriors and fighters, well, that's what they were, but that's not what we are. That's what they thought. They still held to the gentle teachings, peaceful teachings of Jesus. Right? Some of them actually considered these old wars and all these things to be symbols, foreshadowing, talking about Christ. References to Joshua being a symbol of Christ and his war against the Canaanites, and these different little things that pop up here and there. Different writers looked at them different ways, but they never had a problem reconciling it. But as time went by, obviously, as people start to think more and more about these things, they start thinking some of the same things that we think today. Well, how can it be? And they start trying to come up with explanations. And there was a man about named Marcion in the 2nd century, and he had this theory, right, that all the wars in the Old Testament, all those punishments and all those things in the law, those didn't come from the supreme God, from the Father of Jesus. this good God that we know from the New Testament. But he said that was the God of the Jews. He was a just God, but he's a different God. He's a lesser deity. He's inferior. Now, the church could not accept that, right? That there were two gods. And so they tried to come up with some explanation, right, to refute these arguments. And so they started to look and find warlike characteristics in the God of the New Testament. Right? But the problem with that is when you start trying to take all these warlike things and attach it to the God of the New Testament to say, no, let's see, they're really the same. Just because you're trying to combat a different idea, then you start to put the peacefulness of the gospel in danger. Right? Because there's other explanations, right, that we'll talk about as we go. But there's one guy that said, to this guy's credit, right, this church preferred to put away the Old Testament than to add any kind of hint of war to the God of the New Testament, to this peaceful God of the New Testament. So that was an admirable thing, but neither of them went about it the right way. Now, if we look at the writings of Tertullianus, he tells us that Christians started to justify their use of arms by looking at the Old Testament. Okay? You know, they would go and say, well, Joshua, he fought against Jericho and against the Canaanites, right? He led this battle. Samson, Jephthah, the guys we were talking about a minute ago, right? But they didn't always use the best arguments. They weren't always the most intelligent. Besides Joshua, there were guys that said, well, Moses carried a rod, and Aaron had a buckle, and John the Baptist wore a leather belt, right? So I can be a soldier. He wore a belt. That means you can be a soldier. That's a very strange argument, right? There were other Christians that justified going to the public shows, right? They said, well, David danced before the ark, and Elijah was the charioteer of Israel. Right? So if Elijah was in a chariot, how come I can't go watch the chariot games? Okay. And so they had kind of strange justifications sometimes. But one fact remains that once we get to a point where Christians are participating in the army and it's a problem and we say, hey, wait, we need to address this. Well, because you believe that the wars in the Old Testament are justified, that those things happen by God's will, well, you can't just say, well, war is always bad. Because there were these wars that you don't think are bad, right? You think that they're totally justified and commanded by God. So there's something in there. Now, one way to think about it is that God has kind of different standards for different people as they go along, and lets them kind of do different things. And you can see how things get revealed slowly at some times. And you think about maybe like a mother who has a child and feeds him milk at first, but then later, once he's ready, moves him on to solid food. And that's kind of an idea that maybe the Jewish law was kind of a stepping stone, right? To get from all this that they had and go for a time and get to Christianity. So that's one possible explanation. Others, like Origenes, he considered these Old Testament wars as parables and allegories. He was like, these are examples for us. We can look back and see all these spiritual warfare. But the basic facts remain the same, that the Christians of that time believed that these wars were from God and that it was the will of God, but they believed that God's will for those ancient Jews and ancient Hebrews was different than His will for them. And so they followed Jesus. Now, Another category is some apocalyptic wars. Okay? Instead of wars in the distant past that we know God approved of, Jesus tells us about wars that are going to happen in the future. Right? There's going to be there's this idea of at the end of the age, God is going to come and destroy the wicked, and there's going to be all these wars, and the Messiah is going to set up his kingdom. Right? The Jews had that idea. They wanted their Messiah to come and get their kingdom back. Right? The Christians had basically the same idea. They just didn't see it as the same kind of kingdom. He said, Jesus spoke about wars that were going to come. The Apocalypse, the Revelation of John, that's full of war. You know, whenever the first seal and the second seal and the fourth seal get opened up, all these wars break out. Right? All these terrible things. You see Christ pictured in that as the conqueror coming in. He's got a sharp two-edged sword coming out of his mouth. Right? Kind of interesting that it's not in his hand, it's coming out of his mouth. But there's a great conflict mentioned there, right? With the beast and the kings of the earth, and Jesus will defeat them in this terrific slaughter, and they'll all get thrown into a lake of fire, right? And all the enemies will be destroyed. Wars against Gog and Magog, right? Satan will go out into the four corners of the earth and gather these armies against the people of God, and so that's part of what Christians believe. Right? You look at the writers from that time period, and one after another, they're discussing these ideas and looking forward to this coming destruction, where evil is going to be destroyed and the Messiah is going to come back. So if you accepted wars a long time ago, and you know that there's going to be wars in the future, right? Well, what part does a Christian have in that? It's interesting, though, that while they discussed all these things happening, they never really saw themselves as earthly warriors, right? Fighting for the Messiah's victory. You look, those battles were all going to be fought by angels, right? Angelic forces. Michael, the archangel, leading the way, or something like that. Or they considered it a spiritual war, figurative war. Because after all, the Apocalypse, the Revelation of John is full of figurative language. It goes back to the book of Daniel. You know, beast isn't a beast. Maybe it's a nation or something. There's all sorts of symbolism. There's not a giant woman riding a big red beast. So there's all these symbols that come out. And so how exactly do you interpret that? Well, it's kind of hard. And if you look at the history, it's really not until the time of Constantine, right? When he leads comes in and makes basically Christianity acceptable and all of that in the Roman Empire. It wasn't until his success and his victory that Christianity seemed to be bound up with military victory. Okay? Before that, there were, like we'll talk about, there's Christians in the army, but it was never really a Christian victory. You know, it was the Romans taking victory. But when Constantine came in, it was kind of the Christians versus the pagans. So we'll talk about that more later on. But it wasn't even until much, much further after the time of Constantine that the idea of a Christian holy war ever came around. So, but it did happen eventually. But this idea that Christians were going around fighting for good, you know, fighting for their religion, in these early centuries, it didn't really happen. You look at this idea of a warrior Jesus coming back to conquer his enemies. That was the idea that they had in their mind, but it never turned them into revolutionaries. You know, they never tried to go and overthrow the government and get rid of the Romans. You know, do the kind of things that the Jews wanted the Messiah to come back and do. That's not what we see. In fact, you know, the Jews tried to turn against the Romans, and that's going to lead us into our next section. About the Jewish war. But again, if we say you've got this idea of past wars, right? right? That means you can't say all war is bad because those wars were good. Also, if you're thinking about Christ coming back and destroying all these people and there's going to be this great war and it's going to be for good and we're going to win, well then, again, all war isn't bad. That's some measure of acceptance of the idea of war. Now we come to this Jewish war of AD 67 to 71. Now this is kind of a special case of those apocalyptic wars. Right? This is a war in the future. Though for the Christian writers of the time, it had actually been a war in the past. But this one wasn't going to take place in the distant future at the end of the age or anything. Like it was coming within a generation. Jesus said, Jerusalem will be destroyed, the temple, not one stone will be left on another. And if you look in the writings of Eusebius, he says that shortly before the siege of Jerusalem, right around 70 AD, there was a revelation that came to some of the Christians there, an oracle, and they all left. They left the city, and they crossed over the Jordan River, and they went to stay in Pella. And they didn't involve themselves in the fighting. And we talked about that a little bit last night. Or they didn't participate. We mentioned that, I think, when we talked about Jesus saying, flee to the mountains. Right? They really did. And they went over the river, they went to the other side, and they didn't fight, even though all the Jews stayed. Right? All the Jews in that place. Now, if you look at the history, you can go through tons of different writers, and guys looking at it, but the unanimous verdict of Christians who wrote after AD 70 was that this Jewish war was a divinely ordained punishment inflicted on the Jewish nation for their sin in rejecting Christ, and their sin in rejecting what God wanted them to do. They quote all sorts of passages from the Old Testament, talking about God's coming destruction if you don't do what I tell you to do. Right? And they look at that and they say, look, they killed Jesus. They didn't do what they were supposed to do. They didn't repent. They didn't turn to Jesus even afterwards. Right? Many Jews did, but not all. Right? They still wanted their own state. They still wanted their own way of life. And God took that away from them. That was the view of that. So again, this war, it's kind of both, right? God is punishing his people. Now that leads us into this idea that war is an instrument of divine justice. Right? God uses war to punish. And that's really the way early Christians looked at it. Right? That's the way it's seen in the Scripture, both in the Old and the New Testament. This Jewish war is an example of it. Clement of Rome, he's talking about God, and he says this from Isaiah, if you are unwilling and will not hear me, the sword will devour you. Okay? God says if you're not going to listen, you're going to get destroyed. Tertullian, he recounts how God sent all these nations in to punish Israel. Right? You look back at the book of the Judges. Right? There's all these times where they turned to idolatry or they turned away from God for one reason or another, and God sent the Moabites and Canaanites and the Midianites and the Philistines and all these different people that they had been told to destroy before, but they did not. Then he turned it around and used those people to punish his people for their disobedience. Now, Cyprianus, another of those old writers, he said in answer to the pagan that complaint that there's all these wars and famines and terrible things that are happening, and they said, look, it's because of you, right? Well, he says, no, you say that it happens because your gods aren't worshipped by us, but it's really because our God's not worshipped by you, right? Our God's sending all these things, punishing you because you won't listen to him. So you can see the divine justice there, or the belief in it. Now, this idea that God used these wars to punish, it doesn't mean that you have to necessarily take part in the punishment yourself. Just because you believe that God punishes people through war, that doesn't mean that you have to be a part of it. Well, there are other ways. And if you think about it, God doesn't just punish people through war, right? He sends plagues on people, right? Persecution. So if we're going to say, well, God uses war to punish, so it's okay for us to go to war, well, then that means that it's okay for Christians to spread plagues, right? And persecute their fellow Christians. That doesn't really make any sense, right? That's really absurd. Because it just doesn't work, right? You have to consider it for a little bit. It's not, you can't just take part in war with such an easy conscience because of that. The simple fact, though, at that time, was that God Himself, in the Christian view, brought about war. Right? From time to time, in place to place. He raised up foes and sent them to war. Right? And that means that, again, Christians could not reject war in every sense. And universally, we can't say that war is always wrong because, well, God uses it a lot. Now, we come to this next part, the function of the state. In this section, we're going to look at how the church felt about the state and the government. And you really look, as a whole, they thought it was useful, right? Necessary. And in fact, ordained by God. Right? That God set up the governments of the different places and allows them to operate because they secure life and property and peace. They prevent and punish all different kinds of human sins. You know, murder and theft. We're all familiar with the fact that governments punish those things. And also that those are things that God doesn't want us to do. Paul told the Romans, there's no authority except from God. And those who exist are ordained by God. It says, for rulers are not a terror to the good work, but to the evil. It says, do you desire to have no fear from authority? Then do what's good. And you'll be praised from the same. He's the servant of God to you for good. But if you do what's evil, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain. The authority has a sword. It's right there. For he is a servant of God, an avenger for wrath to him who does evil. Okay? For this reason, we also pay taxes because they are servants of God's service. Continually doing this very thing. That's what they do. That's what their life is devoted to doing. That's very interesting. Paul here says, the government set up by God, and the government has a sword. Okay? To punish wrong. Okay. That's interesting. Okay. Peter, when he talks about the government, he says to submit to every institution, human institution, for the Lord's sake. He says, honor the emperor. Right? But the emperor is killing us. How do you reconcile it? We'll keep going. This idea of civil government being set up by God is brought out in really most of the writers from our period. It's a really long list. Lemons of Rome, the fourth gospel, that's John, Polycarp, Athenagorius, Acts of John, Theophilus, Acts of Apollos, Irenaeus, Tertullianus. All these guys have this idea that God set up the government, or allowed the government to be set up. God is giving His authority to the government to do some things. Now that idea is absent from a couple of the guys, Cyprianus and Novius. But still, most of the people there talk about it, just because a couple of guys will mention it. Now, if you think of that, all of that frankly recognizes that there's something right about these judicial penalties, about being sentenced to whatever in the court, right? Even the death penalty. Because these, you go all the way back to the time of Noah, when they came out of the ark. God says, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, right? So there's some accountability there for bloodshed. And that's part of the God-given responsibility that these authorities have. Now, Irenaeus, one of these writers, he says that the magistrates, the judges, they're wearing the laws as a garment of justice. They're not going to be punished or questioned for what they do justly and lawfully. Right? If the judge follows the law, that's what he has to do. Right? But the judge is going to get in trouble when he's corrupt, when he's taking bribes, when he's not following the law, right? So there's this idea that there's some rightness, some justice. It says that earthly rule was set up for the benefit of the Gentiles, right? Because basically, if we didn't have government, we'd just all kill ourselves, right? We'd just kill each other. We would destroy ourselves, fighting and fighting. But as it is, the government sets up laws, and those laws control wrongdoing, right? Maybe some laws we don't agree with, but that's what the government's for. And the apostles, and in a way even Jesus, said submit to the government. Tertullian actually tells the Romans that they should follow their own laws, right? And only use torture until a confession is obtained. Because the Romans would torture people to get a confession. But Christians, even after you confess that you are a Christian, they would keep torturing you, right? That's kind of what he's going against. After you get a confession, don't torture them anymore. Just sentence them according to your law and be done with it. Right? He says it's not, once a man is marked for a due punishment, once he's been sentenced, it's not right to let him go. It's not just or lawful to deny his crime. But you have to follow the law. Now, he's talking to the pagans. He talks about gladiatorial fights. It's very interesting. He says, it's a good thing when evildoers die, when they're punished, rather. He says, who but an evildoer will deny this? Right? That's an interesting thought. Origenes points out, when he's talking about persecution and the power of the government, he says persecution is a misuse of power. Yes, God has given the emperor and all these guys power and authority, but that authority is for good, right? To punish wrong, to punish evil, to praise good men. Persecuting good men is not a proper use of authority. Now, does that mean that we can go against the authority? No, he didn't say that. He was just condemning their misuse of it. Right? Just like if you're in a country where there's corruption in the government, right? You're still supposed to do what the government says. Right? You're still supposed to follow the rules, even though some other people aren't following them. Origenes actually says that the Holy Spirit has given a place for human law and all sorts of things. And that it appears that the earthly judge fulfills a very large part of the law of God. Think of all the things that are in the law of Moses, even, or that go against Christian principles, that are against the law, right? In most places. Now, generally, the laws of God are are stricter than the laws of different countries. But sometimes they're almost the same. There's some things like adultery. Maybe not today, but 100 or 200 years ago, it was against the law. You know, in America, you could be killed for that. Right? There was a law against it. So it's very interesting, the place that God has given the government. Now, if you look at these Christian writings, they often complain about corruption in the system of justice. And they said, look, you need good administration. Right? It's very valuable. And so they were encouraging people to do good. That kind of goes back to what we were talking about the other day. Just because Christians don't use force and don't use violence, that doesn't mean that they can't accomplish something good. That they can't help people and lead them to doing right. Cyprianus complained that not only are the innocent condemned in courts of law, the guilty often don't perish with them. Right? They're just going along and it's all backwards because of corruption, bribery. Like Tacitus, he tells Constantine that, you know, as the ruler, it's his job to correct misdeeds, to get rid of evil men out of the state, right? To remove corruption. And that's what people say today too, right? Most people don't have a problem with the government. They only have a problem with a corrupt government, right? Where bribery and all these greed taken over, right? If the government's doing what's right, everybody's happy. Later, he goes on to say, take away from a king anger, and no one will obey him. He'll be cast down from his high rank. You know, if the king can't put fear into people, he can't very well be a king, right? Because nobody's going to listen to him. So we see that the government was ordained by God. And because of that, it had the right to issue judicial penalties. And it was fair in the penalties that it gave. Right? And so if you consider that, that really implies that in some sense, war is right. Right? And war can be fair. Because if the government that's been ordained by God chooses to go to war to fight against evil, well, that's kind of what they do. Irenaeus, he mentions military acts as among activities generally recognized as useful, right? Military arts. Most people consider those to be useful things. Clemens of Alexandria talks about generalship, and he says, you know, like legislation and administration of justice, that's kind of an important part of government. That's one of the usual ways that people govern. Right? The king makes laws, the king keeps justice, the king has generals. Origenes speaks of the emperor and his soldiers as those who render military service righteously. Right? They're doing it. That's right. That kind of, doesn't that go against what we were talking about yesterday? Right? That Christians don't approve of serving in the military. Particularly yesterday we noticed that Christians don't approve of themselves serving in the military. Right? So, there's some other things like Tacitus. He criticizes Maximus Daza for being ignorant of military affairs. He has satisfaction and gratitude to God for the victories of Constantine over these pagan rulers. Right? You look at Tacitus' closing church history, and he's all full of grateful words and flattering eulogies for Constantine and the fact that he did all these great things, and he overthrew the persecutors and secured peace for the church. Right? That was very nice of him. Right? The church isn't being persecuted anymore. We appreciate that. And so, it made sense also that, if Christians are praying for the emperor, right, we've got these commands and things that we have to, pray for the rulers and authorities, right? If they're going to pray for the emperor, that he would be successful, that he will guard law and order, then it kind of makes sense to pray for his soldiers too, because the emperor's not really doing it. He's using his soldiers. That's the force. They're the ones holding back the barbarians. They're the ones there in the court administering justice, dealing out the punishments. But if you look, prayer for rulers starts out very early in Christian literature. But we don't really see any prayers for the armies until the time of Tertullian, which is over 100 years later. Those things start to come in, but by the time he talks about it, he says it basically like it's the standard practice. That's the way we do it. So the evidence really shows that God ordained civil government. That's what Christians believe. Right? And he did that so that they could restrain sin through force and penalty. Right? That was the expectation. They have a sword. Right? He doesn't have a sword for nothing. There to avenge wrong, to punish evil. But at the same time, even though they believed that God set that up for the government, they held to this idea that a Christian must never inflict any injury on his neighbor, regardless of how wicked his neighbor might be. Right? They had a standard for themselves, and they had a standard for other people. They held themselves to a much higher standard. How can we reconcile these two things? Right? How can we reconcile that I'm not supposed to hurt anybody but you? Well, you can, if you're the government, you can do what you need to do. Well, first of all, just because you're appointed by God to do something does not guarantee that you are innocent. Just because God gives you authority to do something doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want to do. That you're always right. You look even in the book of Revelation, the beast. He's given authority over the people and the saints, but the beast is not righteous. Jesus comes and destroys him and all this stuff because of the horrible things that he did. Right? We talked about this before. You go back to the old law. In the history of Israel, the Assyrians came in and destroyed Israel, and then God brought in somebody to destroy the Assyrians because they didn't do exactly what he wanted them to do. Right? They were being too prideful. They were really trying to wipe them out, and he was just trying to punish. Right? So as long as a ruler is using God's power the way that God wants him to, then that's good. But when he goes beyond what he really needs to do, then he's definitely too far. We also know that God uses the wickedness of some people to punish others. Right? Just because God uses you doesn't mean that you're not wicked. You look at the thoughts of Paul, and you look at these writings. They had this just ruler, right? This servant of God who's going to punish, and he's going to wage war against the unrighteous, and he's going to uphold the laws, right? But that ruler was always a pagan ruler. Right? It was always a pagan ruler. There wasn't a Christian emperor, right? There's even one writer that says, the Caesar would be Christian if it was possible for a Caesar to be Christian. It doesn't work. They always pictured a pagan ruler as the one using this power. Right? And because he's a pagan ruler, he's not a Christian, he's not expected to follow Christian rules. Right? Just like God did not expect the Gentiles to follow the rules of the Jews. Right? They were the rules for the Jews. Not all servants of God are necessarily Christians. That's one fact that we need to keep in mind. And so there's a relative justification here. Right? And it's okay for them to do that. God has given them authority to do that. But we have different rules to follow, right? Now, you look here at this pagan ruler, he's a pagan, right? He's eligible to become a Christian. Anybody can become a Christian if they're going to start following the rules, right? But until you start following the rules, you're not part of our group, right? So, just because I say, well, you can do that in the position that you're in, that doesn't mean that I can, right? That's not a model for my conduct. That doesn't justify me leaving behind the teachings of Christ just because you're doing something. Okay? God gave you authority to do something. Now, you kind of look at all this and somebody might object. And they say, well, that justification there, that leaves all the dirty work to the non-Christians. That means Christians don't have to do anything bad, right? They don't have to do anything objectionable. Go to war. Do all this fighting for your safety, right? Or control all the criminals, right? You're getting rid of your responsibility, you might say. Well, there's a couple of things to say in answer to that. First, you look at that time, the Christians of that time endured more hardship and suffering than any emperor or magistrate or soldier, right? Because not only did they have to put up with all of the normal things that people have to put up with, right? And all the normal dangers that we have of, just living life. But they were persecuted and killed and dragged away from their homes by the very people that were supposed to be protecting them, right? By these soldiers and magistrates. And second, this is something that we really need to consider. Christians have their own method for dealing with sin, right? And for stopping crime. And it's honestly a more effective method. Because the more Christians there are, the less people there are that need to be forced to follow the rules. Because a Christian, by definition, is going to submit to the government. They're going to be gentle and kind. They're not going to use violence. Right? And they're going to try to get other people to live right. Right? So there's a positive force here that comes from Christianity. It's not, I'm not giving up all my responsibility, right? Because there's other things, right? You're going to go to war and fight, well, maybe you send some Christian negotiators. Just because someone's a negotiator, you don't say, well, okay, negotiations didn't work out, so pick up a gun, right? That's not your skill set, right? Different people have different jobs. You can't say just because somebody refuses to be part of the army or refuses to do something that they're useless to society. And when you consider that the power of Christianity, right, and their power to reduce that need to use the sword in other people goes directly in proportion to their number, right? The more Christians there are, the less people are going to get hurt. The more true Christians are to these principles, the more effective they'll be. Okay? Because if half the Christians are saying, yeah, we need to do that, and the other half are saying, well, it's okay. If somebody hits you, you just hit them back. Well, then they're not effective. But if you're following the rules, then it works. All right, so there's some points here to make. So far, these ways that Christians have accepted more, right? As wars in the past or wars in the future that were instruments of God's divine justice or whatever, and this idea of the state, okay? none of those really involved them joining the army. Right? They're all just kind of outside. But there are some cases that we see of kind of a compromise maybe, right? You look at Paul, right? Paul went, and what did he do? He appealed to Caesar, right? He's always talking, making his case before these judges and all these kinds of things, right? Some people say, well, Christians aren't supposed to take people to law. You're not supposed to take people to court. What's Paul going to do? Why is he appealing to Caesar? Well, all of the things that he did were about his own status, right? His own immunity from injustice, because people are trying to kill him, right? And he's trying to say, I don't deserve to die. And every Christian has the right to make his case that he doesn't deserve to die. Right? The thing that we're not supposed to do is try to punish our enemies. You know? And Paul didn't do that. He didn't seek for their punishment. Right? He only sought for his own freedom. Some other cases, Paul has some things that might seem to go against some of these principles, you know. Like we don't see him saying anything to the Philippian jailer about being a soldier. But, you know, that's kind of on the borderline, because we don't know if he said anything or not and what exactly happened to him after that. There's some ways that Paul treats some different situations. There's a guy that he blinds him, right? But you could sort of think of that as divine justice too, Paul being an apostle and having powers that most normal people don't have, kind of on the status of a prophet, right? And so that's, those are kind of on the borderline, right? And we'd have to do a lot of talking and reading to figure out if any of those really make Paul inconsistent in what he was teaching. You look back into history, there's all sorts of Christians pleading and protesting and appealing to the pagan magistrates, right? To the judges. And some scholars look at that and they say, well, see, these guys were going to court. And they were using the pagan courts. It was okay for them. But if you look carefully, these guys were always the defendants, right? In the early cases, at least. I mean, as time goes by, opinions are going to change, right? But at the beginning, they were always the defendants. You know, people were out to get them. They weren't trying to seek punishment for their enemies. They were just saying, look, I don't deserve to die. And that's maybe okay. We see Origenes. He prayed for the emperor in his victory, but he wouldn't fight with him. And he wouldn't fight alongside of him. Some people say, well, that's a little inconsistent. You know, why do you want that guy to win over that guy? Well, you know, if I'm sitting and looking and my country's about to go to war with another country, I might not want it to happen, right? Or this ruler's going to go against this ruler. I might think that they need to do it a little bit differently, but in the end, if one of them is going to win, I might rather want that one to win than this one. And so, you know, if you can wish that, then maybe you can pray that. That's not really entirely inconsistent. Honestly, we don't know how many Christians there were that served in political life, that served as magistrates or sued people in court. But it's pretty clear that before the middle of the 3rd century, that was pretty rare. Right? It didn't happen very much. There's actually a record of, in 272 AD, some Christian bishops appealed to the emperor to eject one of the other bishops, because they had already condemned him of heresy, but because he was friends with the queen, then they couldn't get rid of him. She protected him. So they got the emperor to come in and get him out. Now that's kind of a disgrace to the church, if you've got to call in the emperor to get somebody out. But again, this is 272. That's pretty late. We see around 280 AD that there are Christians that are serving as governors over some of the provinces. You know, once Constantine won, once he won the fight And he was the emperor, and he set up this stuff. Most of the other barriers for Christians serving in office and serving in the army were taken. There was a restriction that the clergy, the priests and stuff, they weren't supposed to shed blood and or administer justice outside the church. It's very interesting. So even at that point, there were still kind of a double standard appears in Christianity. Some Christians went with them, but basically, it came to the point where the average Christian, they could serve in any way that the average pagan could have before, because it wasn't anything in their way. And so as time went by, things changed. Now a couple of quick points, and we'll get into our snack. We'll do this one here first. This experience of Christian good in soldiers. There's all sorts of accounts where soldiers were nice to Christians. Yesterday we talked about times where soldiers were mean to them and did all these things and beheaded them and killed them and persecuted them. But there were some that were nice, right? And some even that, they had faith and they really showed respect to these guys. You can think of, in the New Testament, the soldiers who came to John the Baptist, they wanted to know, what do we do, right? The centurion in Capernaum, Jesus healed his servant. The one at the cross that said, after Jesus died, wow, this truly was the Son of the gods, right? And then Cornelius, obviously, who was the first Gentile convert to Christianity. There's Sergius Paulus, who was the proconsul of Cyprus. He listened to Paul and it says he believed him, but it doesn't say much else about him. Then there's a story outside the New Testament, but about a story in the New Testament where James was to be beheaded. The soldier that brought him there apparently brought him to the judgment seat, confessed that he was a Christian, and so he was beheaded along with James. But that if he was a soldier, he was kind of a nice guy. The jailer at Philippi, who was kind to Paul, and be converted to Christianity. There were soldiers who cared for Paul. There was a centurion named Julius who took him to Rome and protected him from some of the others that were going to kill all the prisoners. Listened to him, gave him a good place. Paul had a lot of freedoms, even though he was kind of on house arrest in Rome. We see soldiers treating the apostles with kindness and other people, even while leading them to death. So, on the one hand, the soldier is about to go kill this person, right? But still, they're defending them from insults. It's like, well, it's my job to kill you. I'm sorry. You're a good person, it seems like, but So there's they're kind of conflicted, right? And that actually led to a lot of soldiers converting to Christianity, right? When you're told to kill this person, maybe in a possibly horrible way, and they say, sure, okay, and they submit meekly to it and they don't fight you, that's kind of unusual, right? And so that really affected the soldiers that did that, and many of them converted to Christianity. Some of them would allow special privileges to the prisoners or let them have visitors. Like I said, some of them became Christians, and then many of them right afterwards were martyred, because if you've got a job to go kill this person, and you say, I can't do it, I'm a Christian now, and this person has changed my life, well then, you might find yourself dead within a few days. And that's what happened a lot of times. We've got this section on Christian participation in military service. Let me see how long it is real quick before we go. All right, well, let's go through it quickly, and we'll save all the summary stuff for the second part. So from the New Testament, here's where we see people participating in military service, right? These are Christians that were also soldiers. We're going to start in the New Testament and go through and just get a rough idea. See what we can see. In the New Testament, we talked about those guys, John the Baptist, a couple of the centurions. They're not really disciples of Jesus at all, right? So we don't really consider them in this. Sergius Paulus, like we said, he believed Paul, but then that's the end of the story. He doesn't seem to really be a full convert to Christianity, right? So he's kind of off the list. That guy who led James to his execution, he died right away, so he didn't really have any decisions to make as to whether or not to participate in the army, right? That leaves us with Cornelius and the soldiers that are with him and the jailer at Philippi, right? Those 3 or 4 guys are the only real cases of soldiers in the New Testament, okay? 3 or 4. The New Testament and the early Christian writings don't say anything disapproving about these guys. It doesn't say that they left the service or that they didn't, right? It doesn't really say anything bad about the military calling in general. You know, we talked about that. There's some reasons for that because the situation of the times, that wasn't much of an issue. Now, there's a few cases here, so that makes it possible that from the earliest time, there were Christian soldiers, right? Soldier converts. And you can imagine that if Cornelius did stay in, that he had some influence on the people under him, right, and the other people that he met, and people might have converted to Christianity. Okay? But, as a matter of the facts, there's no trace of any existence of any Christian soldiers between those 4 in the book of Acts and about 170. Right? So it's over 100 years, about 120 years. There's no evidence. There are a few things that some people say, but some of them are forgeries, and the dating is unreliable. You can't tell if it's from then or possibly from later. So that's the fact. Okay. But in AD 174, there's the Legio Fulminata, right? The Thunderstruck Legion. And we know that there are a considerable number of Christians in that. Some accounts say that the whole legion was Christian, but those are probably really exaggerated. It's an interesting story. There was a drought, and supposedly the Christians there prayed for rain, and then it rained, and then everybody was happy. The pagan accounts of this legion and the rain, they don't record the Christians at all. But the different Christians accounts, some of them say the whole legion was Christian, some of them a lot. Some say that the Christians were just there in the area, but not actually part of the legion. But it seems pretty likely that there were several Christians, at least in this legion in 174. So that means that there had to be some soldiers converting to Christianity before that, right? We don't know for how long. There's a statement that's often made that no one ever criticized these guys. Right? We don't have any record of these guys being criticized for their position by their fellow Christians. Okay? But you got to consider just a few years after that, about AD 180, right? Celsus, that heathen philosopher, he was disapproving of Christians because they generally objected to military service, right? So that was kind of the standard practice at that time. If you consider the later position of the church, right? The fact that after Constantine and all of that, war became pretty acceptable. They might have tried to go back and remove some early records. That's always a possibility. So we can't really make a conclusion that just because it doesn't say anything, that no one said anything. But again, we really can't decide when we're going. There's a guy named Julius Africanus. He was a soldier in 195, but he really wasn't much of a Christian Christian epics hadn't really come upon him very much. So you can see he wrote an encyclopedia. He talks about how to poison wells and food and wine, and he's got a whole section on aphrodisiac secrets full of obscenities and everything. So this guy, though he was a Christian at least in name, maybe not such a good example. There's the evidence from Clint of Alexandria. He talks about those who come to the faith while they're soldiers. He tells them, listen to the general who orders what is righteous, implying listen to God. He never really expressly forbids Christians from serving in the army, but he gives some evidence that there were some. Of their soldiers, lots of them converting to Christianity because of the work of their persecution. They're doing these horrible things, and they just have to stop, right? A lot of them were martyred very quickly. We don't know how many continued in the army. The oldest piece of evidence that we have for Christian soldiers joining the army after becoming Christians is Tertullian, about 200 AD. Okay. So it's at least 150 years after Cornelius and all of that we have evidence of Christians becoming soldiers instead of soldiers becoming Christians. Okay? So very well before that, any Christian soldiers that were mentioned may very well have been converted after the soldiers. Right? That obviously would have been the more common case, seeing what we know so far. It's known that soldiers were very often martyred and persecuted in the middle of the 3rd century, so about 50 years after Tertullian. There were lots of persecutions, and soldiers were often the first ones to die. Harnick, that German scholar we were talking about the other day, said the number of Christian officers and soldiers gradually increased. We have this edict of toleration in 260 AD that we're maybe not going to persecute the Christians. So, and you see that the military authorities, they started making allowances for Christians. Right? Because before, you had to offer the sacrifices and dedicate these things to Caesar. Well, now the Christian officers there are making the sign of the cross instead of whatever sign for Caesar, right? And so eventually, they just kind of told the Christians, you don't have to come to the sacrifices anymore. We're not going to make an issue of it. Don't ask, don't tell. In 295, there's a Christian soldier who's put on trial. He won't serve. He says, I'm a Christian, I don't want to fight. And the judge that's talking to him, the proconsul, says, in the sacred retinue of our lords Dioclenes and Maximinus, Constantius and Maximus, there are Christian soldiers, and they serve, right? And these other armies, there's Christian soldiers, they're fighting, why won't you? Right? So there's evidence that there were ones that were even serving and fighting. In 303 AD, the emperor began to try to get Christians out of his army, try to get them to desert their faith. He used all sorts of kinds of abuse. In 299, Veturius tried to purge his troops of Christian soldiers. Let's get all the Christians out. Some of them retired, some of them were killed. But there, you see them being there. In the persecution of 302 AD, Christian soldiers were some of the first victims. We have a record here of Julius, who was one of them, and he actually told the judge, he said, look, I've served for 27 years. I've never come before a judge before, never been a problem. I've gone on 7 campaigns. No one ever found me standing behind somebody. I fought just as well as anybody. Right? If I was faithful in all that, then why are you questioning me now? So it's clear that here in 302 AD, we have Christians going out and fighting, and just like everybody else, taking part in actual warfare. It's very clear. But we don't know, again, how many. There's a reference here to the Christians of Armenia. The emperor tried to force them to abandon their faith, and they took up arms, and they defeated him. Right? They defeated the armies of that emperor because they weren't going to abandon their faith. Then finally, here we have in the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Okay, this is kind of a famous battle of Constantine. Constantine's troops, they actually had the sign of the cross on their shields and on their standards, right? That was their battle sign, because Constantine had a dream, and he saw the cross above the bridge, and so he said, well, we're going to do that. So he followed that. Those guys took part in the bloodshed of the battle. They doubtlessly joined their leaders' confident boasting that they had conquered by the sign of the cross. Right? So for sure, the time of Constantine, 311, 317, something like that, we have Christians fighting and killing. There's several that and a few later battles. They were really seen as a battle between Christianity and paganism, right? Because Constantine was kind of the Christian emperor. Even though he wasn't Christian, his mother was, and he took up Christianity later on his deathbed. But because he was fighting for that sign of the cross, that was kind of a Christian victory over paganism. Right? And then he kind of set people free. Right? And the persecution was gone and all of that. But we have to ask real quick, how many Christian soldiers were there? Okay. That's an interesting question. We know that there were more at the end of the 3rd century than in the middle. Okay. We don't know how many more. But around the year 300, there were more than in 250 and 260. Right? 260 is when it kind of started to go up. We also know that around 300 AD, the emperors tried to purge the Christians from their ranks. Right? Let's get rid of all these Christians. That seems to indicate that the percentage could not have been very high. Because if you think about it, no ruler is going to deprive himself of a 10th of his army, right? Or even a 20th. You don't just say, well, I'm going to get rid of 10% of my army when I'm about to go to war. It doesn't work. So there wouldn't have been all that many. On the order of thousands, possibly. There were a lot of people in the Roman army. But even at this point of Constantine and him coming in and these Christians fighting, it was still not unanimous that Christians could fight. In fact, we saw those church orders that were in effect that Christians could not serve or be part of. So we're going to have our break. It's a little late.